We are pleased to be joined by Dan Labatz. Dan is a longtime activist, a member of Solidarity and the Democratic Socialists of America. He's an editor of New Politics magazine and author of many books, including The Troublemaker's Handbook, Rank and File Rebellion, Teamsters for Democratic Union, recently Radioactive Radicals, which is something I really would like to discuss with you on a subsequent show. And many more books and articles, and you can see most of them at Dan Labatz's website, and I'll give that. It's Dan Dan Labatz Labotz writings WRITINGS.com. All run together, danlabatzwritings.com/. And that said, Dan, among many other things, writes a weekly column on the United States for the French publication L'Anticapitaliste in France, and that is reprinted in English in International Viewpoint. And I urge people to go check out the International Viewpoint magazine. Dan, two of your most recent articles are 4th of July at 2:50, the ongoing struggle for equality, democracy, and justice. And more recently, following on Trump's diatribe on TV, Trump says U.S. elections rife with fraud, demands new election law, may send troops to polling places. And you ask the question, is he preparing a coup? So maybe just sort of starting off with a discussion of the sort of the weak democracy we have in this country and its origins. After all, it was what July 4th was the 250th birthday. There was a lot of celebration, a lot of triumphalism, a lot of lies. And wanted to get your thoughts about that. And you in particular say we should be celebrating the underdogs, the dissidents, the rebellious ones who fought and continue to fight against exploitation and oppression, and stand for equality, democracy, and justice. Dan, yeah, give us some of your thoughts about the origins of the American Revolution and its goals, and to what degree we've actually managed, in a halting way, to move beyond the limitations of that.
I'll be happy to, though I fear that when historians do this, Trump will order somebody to put signs outside on the walkway saying, "Don't believe a thing you hear here," as he did with the Smithsonian. Um, this country was created by a revolution led by Southern slaveholders and Northern commercial farmers and businessmen. And there was just, at that point, there was just the very tiniest beginning of industry in the North. But those wealthy men are the ones who wrote the Constitution. They wanted to break with England. Why did they want to break with England? Because America was a rich country. It was an enormous potential country. They would like to expand it to fill the continent, as they would. And it had rich land. They had removed the dangerous indigenous people who wanted to keep their land. And they had brought Africans as slaves to work in the fields. And they were making a lot of money. And one of the obvious questions is, why should we share this with the British? Why share it with the British? We do all the work. That is, we organize the plantations, put the slaves in the field. We farm the farms and sell the merchandise, and we invest our money in banks and so on. Why should we share this wealth with them? That's the real origin. And they wanted a republic, but a republic meant the rule of a small elite of the country. That's what republics were in Europe at the time, a result of Republican revolutions in the Western European countries, in England, Holland, France, and so on. And after some turmoil in some places, like France, greater turmoil, in the end, it was the bourgeoisie, as we say, meaning the capitalist class, which became the power in the parliament and the power in the government. and in some cases in England, the old nobility survived along with the capitalists, likewise in France, less in Holland. But um, there were there were republics to be run by the wealthy, the well-educated, the people with connections, and democracy was hated by these people. They didn't want anything democratic in the society if they could avoid it. For example, uh, the one democratic institution we got was the House of Representatives. But the Senate was created as a club of reliable people. Later, the rich man's club in the 19th century was called that, which was not based on representing the people. I mean, we have all these states out west, that are mainly populated by cattle, the Dakotas and Montana and so on. And yet they get as much representation as big states like California or Texas or New York and so on. So the Senate was not meant to be democratic. Or initially, the Senate's representatives were not elected by the voters. They were elected by state legislators, chosen by state legislatures. So, and we have this Supreme Court. They created the Supreme Court in case there was any mistake to have a bunch of old white men who were wealthy, came out of the ruling class to make sure that any law that was progressive could be struck down. And so they were members of the court for life, lifetime appointments. That is the original conception of this republic. An undemocratic legislature, and of course, a tremendous amount of authority in the hands of the presidents. And those presidents, George Washington, one of the biggest slave owners in the South, the first president, and other presidents who followed, like Thomas Jefferson, were slave owners as well. So there was no conception of a democratic republic. The notion was it would be a bourgeois republic, we sometimes say, that is, the wealthy would rule, and democracy was to be avoided and prevented at all costs. That's the roots of the American state and the American political system.
There are really very different
So I
views
just
out
have a
there.
question. I just have a question about that. Of course, we have the first 10 amendments called the Bill of Rights, Dan. Could you tell us how that came about? Because if anything began to open up the tight control that the ruling class had at that time, it was some of those amendments. Could you talk about how that came about?
Yes, absolutely. I'm glad you raised it. I mean, it came about basically as a document resulting from the protests of people who were not part of that ruling elite and who wanted certain states that were more opposed to that model. And and so the Bill of Rights, like the French Rights Declaration of the Rights of Man, it was called, and about the same time, the Bill of Rights gave people these fundamental rights, as you say, that made possible other forms of resistance to this rich man's republic. The right to freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right to assemble, the right to bear arms initially meant that the people would be able to defend themselves and resist a despotism, and religious freedom, which was very important because the United States was not created by one religion. A lot of the people who wrote the Constitution were really deists, that is, people who had given up on Christianity or whatever, and they believed that there was maybe a great force in the universe, perhaps some, but the United States had people who were Catholics, Protestants, of course, predominantly Protestants, then Catholics, some Jews, and the indigenous people with their religions. And so freedom of religion was very important because that was one of the main ways that people in the 18th and 19th century looked at the world, through religious lenses. And so the Declaration of, excuse me, the Bill of Rights was very important in providing opportunities for people then to criticize government, the right to assemble and the right to protest and petition the government. The word petition is so much a part of American history. Whenever I taught history, I always said, this is one of our most fundamental rights and one of the things that most characterizes America is people make up a document and say, would you sign this? What the government is doing is wrong. What a tremendous organizing tool, what a educational tool. And it's one of the most fundamental American concepts. If you believe in petitions, you're in politics, you're likely to be an American, I think. It's not true in every country. And so I'm glad you brought that up because it balances the picture I painted, though the institutions I described were predominant. And the people who went out and spoke freely and published newspapers and so on that were not um, that were not desired could find themselves in trouble. When in Cincinnati, the abolitionists published a newspaper in the 18, I think this would be in the 1830s, advocating the end of slavery. The slave forces come in and went into Cincinnati and destroyed the newspaper and destroyed their printing press. Um, so it's always a struggle to defend those rights that are there in the Bill of Rights.
Thank you.
It seems to me that the history that you write about the last 250 years, it's very contested as to what actually are the dynamics of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and so much more. On the one hand, you've got Christian nationalists who have a lot of political power in this country, and they assert that the United States was founded by Christians who want to build a nation on the foundation of God's will. Um, and that's been, they're part of a kind of right-wing fundamentalism, which sees the notions of equal rights and democracy as a heresy that's incompatible with Christianity. And after all, they reject the ideals of radical democracy. On the other hand, you have the mass demonstrations we've seen, the No Kings demonstrations, where many people are raising the issue of defending the Constitution. And they really, and I think they see that as defending human rights, some bit of equality perhaps, but certainly seeing us as a democracy. And then you have groups like the Democratic Socialists of America who say there's fundamental problems with the Constitution and, among other things, call for the abolition of the Senate, which has raised cries of despair from the Democrats and howling cries of hostility from the Republicans. What do you make of this confusion as to what this country is all about?
Well, I don't know it's that I would call it confusion. I would say that these are different ideologies arising from different social classes about what they would like the country to be about. People are not actually looking to the past. Most of them are not going back and studying the Constitution or something. They are looking to the future and they're saying, what future do we want? As you said it, the fundamentalist, Christian evangelicals, white Christian evangelicals, generally say we want a, a Christian nation, white people are dominant, strong nationalism. That's the country they want. It's not the country. I mean, maybe they think that existed. It's not true. And the people who say, well, the No Kings, I loved in the No Kings demonstrations, which I went to every one I could get to, most of them here in New York City where I live. And I loved it that people brought up everything. I mean, they were demonstrations against Trump, number one, because they said, no kings, we don't want a monarch. Trump is trying to create a monarchy, and we don't want that. And so that was number one. And then they wanted their rights respected. We don't want the police and ICE and the National Guard, especially ICE and the National Guard, in the streets. We don't want the army in the streets. That's not our conception of a democracy. We don't want ICE out there ripping people out of cars and shooting and killing them, as they've done on several occasions to both immigrants and to U.S. citizens. Um, so people were angry at ICE. Once the Iran war, the U.S. war against Iran started, people were against the war. That is, they were using these demonstrations as an indictment of everything about the Trump administration. They didn't like its tariffs. They didn't like its misogyny. There were so many wonderful, wonderful posters by women about these sexist policies, the misogyny, and posters about racism and both and xenophobia and the hostility to Latin American immigrants and so on. So those are people who want a future that has no such wars as the war on Iran, that has no such tariffs that are really an economic game and punishment and a way for Trump to, having wiped out all the social programs and cut taxes, a way for him to try to finance the government and so on. People want a different kind of country, and those demonstrations are saying the Constitution is really about that, that we, the people, have the right to decide what kind of a nation we want, how we want to live. I think so. That's the way I see those differences. I don't see them as genuine investigations into the past. I see them as different social classes or sometimes social groups. The white evangelicals are not in one class; they're kind of strung out in all the social classes. Um, oh, I should also mention in the No Kings, there was in some of those demonstrations very good participation from some of the unions, at least here in New York. And I think that was important. People saying part of a democratic America is an America with strong labor unions. So each group is projecting not what it read in the past, but what it wants for the future, as
Indeed.
I see it.
Well, you indicated you live in New York City, my hometown, and you have a Democratic Socialist mayor now. How do you think his program reflects the interests of working class people? And where do you see the shortcomings and what do you support there?
Well, I supported Mamdani's election. I think it was an important step. And he's not only the first socialist mayor here, he's the first Muslim mayor. And I think that's also important that in a country with freedom of religion, you can have a Muslim rule a predominantly Christian and Jewish city, though there are like about 1 million Muslims here too. Um, what do I think of? Well, I think his program is great. He used his power as mayor and his influence to immediately freeze some rents for some people in the city and to go after attempting to create more affordable housing. He went and was able to make some sort of arrangement with Governor Hochul to get money to fund preschool education for children 3 to 5 years old. Now, that's not just education, that's also childcare for millions of working people who need childcare so they can go to work and earn a living. And childcare here is extremely expensive. And so that's another very good part of his program. Uh, the transportation, he's had more trouble trying to implement his transportation program, which was having free buses that actually ran on time. And he's working on that. I view that he's been in office only a short time, so we're still talking about a very early in mayoral term. Um, on the police, some people are critical of his position on the police. Um, I'm not a person who believes the police can or should be abolished in the system in which we live, as some leftists argue. I think that we need, I think, I go through my neighborhood. I live in a predominantly African American and Afro-Caribbean neighborhood called Crown Heights, also filled with lots of Orthodox Jews. And my black neighbors here, I talked to them. What do you think about abolishing the police or defunding the police? And they were, no, please. These are people who lived in a city with a lot of crime, and what they want is responsible, honest, non-racist police, non-violent. You can't be totally non-violent if you're a cop, but you can certainly get rid of the way that the police operate, and make them operate. I've been thrown in jail here a few times for demonstrations, and I just find it weird. Like, you take somebody to the jail, you could say, okay, sir, come with us, and take them to a room where there's a nice soft couch and have a seat. And, I guess that's in Norway and Sweden that would happen. But of course, the minute they arrest you, they begin to rough you up. And they didn't do that to me, I think, because I was with a group. We had good lawyers and a lot of publicity, and I'm an old man and I can hardly see. So those things, they treated me all right. But of course, we know how they treat poor people, black people, Latinos, gay people, LGBT people on the street. So I understand people's concern that Mamdani has made a deal not to confront the current uh, head of the police department, a very wealthy woman. Her name is slipping my mind for the moment. Um, but a billionaire who's the head of the police department, and not to confront the police. I think if you're a new socialist mayor in town, a new Muslim socialist mayor in town who's 35 years old, that you have to decide what battles you're going to take on. I understand that. I think that's reasonable. If at the end of 4 years, he's made a lot of mistakes, that will be unfortunate. But right now, I think he deserves our support. And the way that people should deal with Mamdani is that when he puts forward good things, we should be out there in the streets uh, to make those things happen. He doesn't have all the power to make those things happen, though he has a lot of support. What else could I say about this? Um,
Well, maybe a little bit about how this 35-year-old Muslim socialist became mayor, what kind of organizing took place that enabled that to happen, and what can we use from that experience around the rest of the country, assuming, of course, we support the idea of electoral politics.
right, that's a very important point. Again, I'm glad you raised it. Um, he ran for office and he began with the backing of the Democratic Socialists of America. Partly thanks to his campaign, it's now an organization of 120,000 members, the biggest organization on the left since the 1940s. And he, but of course, that wasn't the 12,000 or 10,000 DSA members here are not the ones who did all the work on his campaign. He's a very charismatic guy, he's a handsome guy. He's very well spoken. He's very thoughtful. He approaches things in such a way that he made it very possible for people to like him. And he did so while still making clear on a very delicate issue in New York. New York, most places in the United States, the Jewish population is 1 to 2%. Here it's 18% of the population. So, but he was very frank that he was an opponent of Zionism. He was an opponent of Israel as a religious country where people were not equal, that he supported the Palestinians in Gaza, that he was a supporter of the Palestinian cause. Now, many Democrats thought, oh God, if you did that, that's the death on your campaign. But of course, that was a rallying cry for many Muslim voters, Arab voters, for many young voters. Uh, and that was a very, very important issue.
Thank
And
you.
let's turn to the issue, really the political crisis that you wrote a brief piece on in response to the recent TV speech by Donald Trump, uh, saying that the elections in this country have been fraudulent, that he did win in 2020, and making a plea to Congress to go ahead and pass some legislation which would severely curtail voting rights across this country. Perhaps, I mean, there's an estimate like something like 21 million people would likely lose the right to vote. Your thoughts on that issue, and you even raised the question as to whether or not, um, as a fallback, is Trump preparing a coup?
No, I would start out. Let's go back 10 or 15 years as the Republicans began in many parts of the country to purge voter rolls, to get rid of people from who tended to be black or Latino or older or students. Students partly because they're and poor people. Students and poor people are easier to purge because they move more and they have different addresses and so on. So, but the idea was to get rid of people who potentially would vote Democratic. Not all of those people vote Democratic all the time, but you're more likely to find Democrats in those groups. Then they took on this campaign supported by the US Supreme Court to gerrymander the electoral districts. It used to be that we had a census every 10 years, and then you went in and you redrew the districts in order to uh, reflect the population. Each district should reflect an equal part of the population in that state. But then Trump and the Republicans saw an opportunity. Let's redistrict now. Let's start in a place like Texas, where we've got very good friends there. Governor Abbott. So the Republicans went to Governor Abbott and said, let's redistrict here. Redistricting meant that you redraw the lines around a district. And they were called gerrymanders because when this happened in the 19th and early 20th century, sometimes the district looked like things, and somebody said, that looks like a salamander. They were so odd shapes, you know. A salamander is a lizard. And then somebody said, well, let's call it a gerrymander. I don't know who Jerry was, but I don't remember that part of the story.
That was Eldridge. That was Eldridge, Jerry.
No, thank you. And so,
Okay.
man, you're my historical reference here. Thank you. And so, uh, and so they redrew these districts in our time to cut them up in such a way that I think in Memphis they had three black people in a district there. So you redraw the district in such a way that you only will have just one black representative. You're going to redraw those lines. If you have some small group of black people, let's move them into a big Republican district. Well, they'll be insignificant, and they could not possibly elect a black candidate. And then the Supreme Court came in and went and looked at the Voting Rights Act, and the Voting Rights Act, which attempted to give better reflect representation for black people, and um, and the Supreme Court decided, well, that was racism. They were trying to count blacks more than was really fair or right. That was a racist decision, said the Supreme Court. So we're going to allow people to redraw those districts in a lot of states in the South. So the Republicans have picked up a bunch of seats. Now the Democrats also tried this in California successfully, in where was it, Virginia unsuccessfully. But the Democrats did not pick up as many seats in redistricting as the Republicans did, and they've got a dozen or so new seats. So for the it's going to be harder for the Democrats to win the election. I would say, I know there's a lot of enthusiasm for Democrats. Trump is at a real low point in popularity. People don't like his tariffs. They don't like his war. They don't like have the army and the ICE in the streets killing people. And so Trump's popularity is falling, but it's still going to be a big battle for Democrats to attempt to win a majority in the House and the Senate. And the Senate's going to be the most difficult. And one of the things there, of course, is the state of Maine, which there's been a lot of discussion about Graham Plattner and now Troy, whether they can win the election there. Uh, but I think that we have all of that. Now, Trump is preparing this, but all this makes it clear that Trump does not want to lose this election. And he's refused to say, he's been asked several times, will you send troops and ICE agents to the polls? And he's refused to say no. I'm not ruling anything out. Yes, we could do it. We could send ICE and the army to the polls. Now, that is unconstitutional. You can't send the army to the polls, and it's illegal. It's not allowed in U.S. law, and it's often outlawed. A lot of states have laws against any person with a gun being in a polling place. Though some states, of course, some of the Republican states allow people with concealed weapons to carry them into the poll. But all of those things show the fact that he's not willing to rule out. So what happens if you sent the army in there? What are they there for? Are they then going to say, well, we got to make sure this is a fair election. Let's let Army and the ICE count the votes. Or, okay, the Army and ICE are there and the votes have been counted. We better take these ballot boxes out of here to make them safe. One can foresee this is a slippery slope that could lead to a coup. And it's interesting that you may know Tom Snyder, a great historian. I think he was at Yale, and now I think he's gone to Canada because he doesn't feel this is the country for him under Trump. And he's a wonderful historian of Ukraine. And he has speculated in an article about the possibility of a coup. He says, not convincingly to me, well, if we're all vigilant and we're all paying attention, and we all go out there and protest or whatever, that we can somehow prevent the coup. I'm not prepared to stop an army. I don't think we are as a group. I don't think we are as the left in this country prepared to stop the army or ICE. And I fear that if somebody decided they could stop the army or ICE, we'll have something happen, as happened recently in an anti-ICE demonstration, that somebody will show up with a gun and shoot it off. And then we'll really be in trouble because they'll be able to blame the left for using guns. And so I think we have to have protests and actions in defense of the vote, in defense of the ballot box, in defense of democracy, but they should be mass peaceful demonstrations that attempt to disrupt and interrupt the actions of ICE and the military. That is, these illegal actions. ICE is not an agency to police elections. Of course, they're going to say they're there to arrest these voters. I think we should add to this the fact that now Trump and Marco Rubio have added this new anti-communist campaign. They call it DSA and the Socialist Communists. This is very reminiscent, obviously, of McCarthyism in the 1950s. And they've made up a list of organizations that they claim are they could destabilize the country and cause the overturn of the system here. So they have to be prevented from destroying our democracy. Included in those, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Democracy Now, the news program, is one of them. It also includes Medea Benjamin's group. Remind me of the
Oh,
name.
yeah. Color.
Oh, Pink.
Oh, good.
Code
Yeah,
Pink.
Code Pink.
Color.
Medea
Code
Benjamin's
pink.
Code Pink. It
Code pink.
includes
Okay.
the party of freedom and or socialism and freedom. Now, I happen to say personally, I'm I like Democracy Now, but I'm not a supporter of those groups most of those groups that are on the government shit list. But I think they have to be defended, not defended for their politics, but defended for their right to hold their politics, to advocate their politics, to publish about their politics. And so I think that that's another thing to take into account here. That is the possibility of a kind of roundup of the left. And I think that we should look out for Marco Rubio holding a rodeo here and rounding up the left, and or of course Trump, and behind much of this stuff is the disgusting, awful Stephen Miller. So I think that all of this seems to me that all of these different actions are an attempt for Trump and it probably accentuated by the fact that his power and influence slipping away here. Even MAGA people turned against the Iran war. Even MAGA people have turned against some of his positions. So he becomes more desperate, and in his desperation, I think he's likely to seize on these more aggressive kinds of actions.
Dan, just concluding thoughts.
Concluding thoughts. Well, I think it's up to us, up to the people who are listening to this show. It's up to the people here in the streets of New York City and across the country to be out demonstrating, protesting, defending our rights, advocating more radical change in the country, supporting radical candidates when they appear, and understanding that both political parties are a problem. The Democrats have as little popularity as Trump. And the reason they have so little popularity is they have no new ideas and no guts. They're not fighters. So I think that we have to keep organizing and pushing and attempting to make this the democratic country that it was not at the beginning, and that every democratic element we have is due to Black people, women, the labor unions. It's due to protest and strikes, and we have to continue that to win a full democratic society.
Well, this has been a very rich discussion, but for time reasons, I think we're going to have to wind it up. Joseph, any quick thoughts?
Well, I just want to thank Dan for being very clear about the fact that the reason why we have any kind of democracy here today is, as Dan says in his wonderful article about the 250th anniversary of this country, it's been the struggle of these people who have brought us to the level of democracy that we have, and it's our struggle to finish the job. And as Dan says, so we must also struggle for the abolition of capitalism and the establishment of democratic socialism. Thank you so much, Dan, for that article and for being with us here.
Happy to be here.